because that is the case, and we don't have time to do all the work to write 15 different APIs to get the data to go from one system to another. And you go, okay, fair enough. But you need to be aware of how you can get that away on a direct award. And again, under PA23, there are slightly different requirements from the current PCR requirements. So you've got to show, again under PA23, broadly similar, but there's no other way of meeting those requirements. And you haven't kind of artificially narrowed those requirements to Microsoft or to Google or to whatever the IT people want to buy. So again, do look at that really, really carefully. The other thing is about urgent requirements. So usually the fleet people are quite good at coming, and there's a range of options for dealing with this. But if your current contract's running out with only 4 months to go, there's usually a constant stream of people coming to your desk to say, we don't have time to do X, Y, or Z, we can't run a procurement in this time available. But the answer to that actually is, don't forget that under the PCR regime and the PA regime, there is accelerated procedures. You might remember the PPM that came out during COVID that said, don't forget about the accelerated restricted procedure, for example, which is 10 days for SQ and then 15 days for tender, because you can cut down the tendering time. But I realise that most of the time is actually taken up because you're most of the time taken up in producing the spec and producing the award criteria. So I realise it's not just those tendering periods or the SQ period that often causes all the problems. But actually, so the first thing is, if you don't have time for the tender periods, can you run accelerated procedures? You can still run those under the PA23. The next thing to do is, could you just use a framework where you've got a list based and you could do a direct award maybe to number one on the framework? PFH has a very good, I'm sure, vehicles framework. But you know, that might be another way of dealing with it. But ultimately, if you have to go with urgency, there is again but it's kind of ramped up a little bit under PA23. It's extremely urgent now. And there's also the requirement that you haven't caused the extreme urgency. And unfortunately, when you say you haven't caused it, that includes your fleet manager and everyone else who should have done a procurement plan as well. So you as an organisation. But ultimately, sometimes you're just forced down that route to do a temporary contract. But even when you do a temporary contract, don't forget Dominic Cummings, because what he forgot to do when he needed to let an extremely urgent communications contract during the pandemic, he just rang one of his friends. And that was excusable at the time, and the Good Law Project didn't come out too well out of the case, because the Good Law Project basically tries to keep everyone on the straight and narrow by basically taking judicial review proceedings against various bits of government when they think they've pulled the fast one. So they sued the Cabinet Office and Dominic Cummings, and the court said actually it was perfectly possible to do an urgent requirement here. But actually what Dominic should have done is not just rung the first friend who came into his mind, but actually even where you're doing a direct award under urgency, you still need to do a little back of the fag packet calculation about who you think is going to best meet your requirements. So you say, if Dominic's got 4 friends, he should have written them all down and then done a little matrix to show how he's objectively come to which of his friends he was going to let the contract to. And obviously, again, I'm slightly flippant there as well. Oh no, that was my best slide. Oh no, there we go. What I've done here, and I won't go all the way through it because I want to leave 5 minutes for questions at the end, is I've done a little, I assume that we can get the slides out to people somehow, but I've done a little translation table where I've put obviously on the left-hand side the PCR exclusions and exemptions, which broadly fall into 3 categories. There's exclusions under Regulation 10, then there's exemptions under Regulation 12, and then the negotiated procedure without notice, which was everyone's friend, Regulation 32, which will be missed under the new regime. Regulation 10, yes, was about land transactions, contentious legal services, which you don't need to go to tender, you can just ring Anthony Collins. Certain financial services, so that's obviously where you're doing funding work and leveraging funding into your organisation, employment contracts. Regulation 12 was about interactions with your TechL. Do you remember Regulation 12 exemptions for TechL subsidiaries and classifying whether all of the organisations in, the companies or organisations within your group were contracting authorities. So Regulation 12, and 32 was about the urgency, exclusive rights, technical reasons, where you could use the negotiated procedure, i.e. negotiate someone without publishing a contract notice. And that roughly translates into these. What I'd encourage you though is just to say that There are some wider things within Schedule 5 for direct award justifications, random stuff like testing prototypes, which actually, I know it sounds random, but if you were doing, let's say, a trial on MMC or something like that, there are some slightly wider Schedule 5 activities which you can get away with. But I mean, my encouragement to you is do try and have a working knowledge of the exemptions and exceptions regimes, because it's sometimes a good way of getting you out of trouble. But equally, I think my other message to you is the Procurement Act is going to change a lot of things, but don't forget that we still need to hold on to and be really aware of all the previous case law. We're not just throwing out all of the case law, you know, the baby with the bathwater. Things like Bromcom or Consultant Connect, which tells us don't get 5 people into demonstrator system, then go to G-Cloud and attempt to put in your requirements until your favourite one comes up. You know, you can't do that. Well, I would never say do that anyway, but you can't do that anymore. And you need to be aware that all that case law, like Consultant Connect case, Bromcom case, etc., is still relevant and still applicable for how we're going to interpret the Procurement Act 23. So with that, I'm really, really grateful to you all listening. I'm going to stick around, as I always do, for as long as people wish to talk. If you want to raise a question now in public, that's absolutely fine. But if you've got a private or embarrassing query, I'll be here for 10 minutes afterwards. Or if it's really difficult, we could go and maybe get a room over there or something like that if it's you don't want to be in public. But anyway, yeah, so thanks ever so much for listening.
Right, great. Thank you, Richard. We'll do some questions, so I'll wander around with the microphone. So if you've got a question for Richard, stick your hand up. That was easy.
Hello there, you're right. I have a good question about transitioning to PA23 when you run frameworks and dynamic markets and DPS. What is the cut-off date that all frameworks at DPS must be regulated by PA23?
Thank you very much for your question. The answer to that is that any new framework that's created after the 28th of October will have to be obviously advertised and regulated by the new regime. But frameworks that are continuing can continue until their expiry. There's a very interesting question about, well, interesting to me, a question about DPSs, because of course they don't have a time limit for expiry. I suspect that we'll see in there may be some guidance. Unfortunately, all the interesting guidance still hasn't come out. I'd hope the guidance on frameworks, on DPS, on dynamic markets, etc. would have been out, and I was hoping to talk to you about that. But no, there's no time limit where you suddenly have to stop using any of the things that have been procured under PCR 15. You can carry on doing that. Sorry.
Saving your legs, Richard. Right, okay.
Hi, it's a very quick question about that £5 million threshold for the contract value. Is that an annual value or a total with extensions, or do you know? Thank you.
Thanks, Guy. Sorry, I can just walk as well. Really good question. The answer is that the £5 million is actually the contract value as calculated under PA23, and that's the standard valuation that we used to use under Reg 6 broadly, and that means all of the amounts of the value that you're definitely going to have to pay, plus any options over the whole of the life of the contract. It gets complicated with contracts with no end date, because then you do use 48-month values, but broadly the whole of it plus options. Any more questions?
Fantastic. Great. Thanks, everyone. And there was a note about the slides. So if we've scanned you, you will get a copy of the slides after the PFH Live is done and dusted. So you can follow up with Richard if you've got any private challenging questions. Thanks again, everyone. Really appreciate your time. Thanks, Guy. No, thank you.